Canada was once the ultimate economic promised land. But right now, a silent financial collapse is unfolding beneath the surface, and the actual math remains largely ignored. Citizens across the country already feel it through a crushing cost of living, stagnant wages, and the exhausting reality of working harder just to fall further behind. This is not just a global inflation hangover, it is a profound structural crisis. The terrifying data reveals exactly why the Canadian economy is rapidly falling behind the United States, exposing how domestic wealth is being systematically drained. The per-capita collapse. The national economic narrative relies heavily on headline gross domestic product, a macroeconomic metric that currently paints an incredibly deceptive picture of national prosperity. On paper, the national economy appears to be surviving, boasting aggregate growth rates that political leaders frequently parade as a triumph of modern governance. But this growth is a mathematical mirage, engineered almost entirely by unprecedented raw population surges. When the economic pie is actually sliced by the number of people living in the country, the reality is utterly devastating. A decade ago, the Canadian economy was highly competitive on the global stage. In 2014, Canada's real GDP per capita sat proudly at over 83% of the American level. That margin of difference was easily justified by a robust social safety net, universal healthcare, and a highly stable banking system that protected consumers. Today, that reality has shattered. By the year 2026, a massive and widening chasm has split the North American economies. While the United States' nominal GDP per capita has soared to over $94,000, Canada languishes stubbornly around the $60,000 mark. Consequently, the average Canadian's economic footprint has collapsed to nearly 63% of their American counterpart. The gap is expanding at a terrifying speed. For the first time in recorded history, Canada's per capita output has slid dramatically below the OECD average. Advanced economies across the globe are getting richer, while the average Canadian citizen is mathematically becoming poorer. This translates into a tragically empathetic reality on the ground, a lost decade of wealth. Everyday citizens are gaslighting themselves into believing they are personally failing, constantly questioning their career choices or financial habits. In truth, they are participating in an economy that is structurally shrinking per person, fighting an uphill battle against a macroeconomic tide that guarantees diminished returns on their daily labor. The productivity capital crisis. Wealth is not generated by magic, political decree, or simple geographic entitlement. It is generated by sustained investment, advanced machinery, and relentless innovation. Right now, Canada is suffering a severe and accelerating capital flight crisis. The net foreign direct investment stock position has reached a staggering negative $1 trillion. Canadian money is desperately leaving the country in search of better yields, and foreign money is outright refusing to enter. This trillion-dollar deficit highlights a catastrophic refusal to build. Canadian businesses are chronically underinvesting in research, development, and commercial scaling. When looking at the critical metric of business investment per worker, the trajectory has essentially flatlined over the past 10 years, acting as the primary catalyst for Canada's recent slide into back-to-back quarterly contractions, a technical recession driven directly by the complete evaporation of domestic and international corporate capital allocation. This refusal to invest creates a domino effect across the broader macroeconomy. Instead of aggressively modernizing, the corporate sector has embraced a productivity death spiral. Because enterprises refuse to invest in cutting-edge software, modern manufacturing equipment, or basic operational efficiency, the Canadian worker is inherently capped in how much value they can produce per hour. It does not matter how hard a worker physically labors if they are using outdated tools compared to their American or European peers. In advanced economics, productivity is the sole engine of long-term prosperity. Without continuous productivity growth, it is mathematically impossible for real wages to sustainably rise. The modern Canadian economy has effectively decoupled human effort from financial reward, leaving workers stranded in a stagnant environment where output cannot scale, profit margins remain dangerously thin, and true economic expansion grinds to an absolute halt. The cheap labor trap. If businesses are entirely failing to buy new machinery or invest in modern technology, the question naturally arises as to how these corporations are sustaining their daily operations. The answer lies in a deeply systemic corporate loophole, the relentless exploitation of an overabundance of lower-skilled temporary labor. In classical macroeconomic theory, capital and labor function as direct substitutes. If a corporation can easily pull from a seemingly endless, rapidly expanding pool of low-wage temporary workers to perform a task manually, it possesses exactly zero financial incentive to spend millions of dollars on software or technology to automate and streamline that same task. This dynamic creates a vicious, self-perpetuating cycle. Rather than investing in long-term technological supremacy, companies opt for the path of least resistance, throwing cheap human bodies at operational inefficiencies. This creates an artificial ceiling on the entire national economy. Instead of transitioning into a highly skilled, high-tech and high-wage ecosystem designed for the 21st century, domestic industries are rapidly devolving into low-margin, low-efficiency models. This structural shift forces the working class into a brutal, unwinnable competition for stagnant wages. Labor markets become oversaturated at the entry and mid-levels, systematically stripping ordinary citizens of their purchasing power. Simultaneously, corporate profit margins are artificially protected by these suppressed labor costs. It is a highly regressive economic framework where capital rigorously avoids risk, national productivity stagnates, and the most vulnerable segments of the population absorb the entirety of the economic pain, all while headline employment numbers desperately mask the rapidly deteriorating quality of the employment opportunities being created within the domestic borders. The elite brain drain. This structural decay triggers a secondary, arguably more catastrophic consequence: the devastating hollowing out of top-tier talent. It is not just financial capital that is fleeing the country by the billions, it is human capital. The smartest, most capable, and most ambitious minds are looking at the stark, macroeconomic math and making the highly rational decision to leave. The resulting exodus of talent is an emergency that severely handicaps the nation's future growth potential. The data surrounding this phenomenon is jarring and historically unprecedented for a G7 nation. Up to 40% of Canada's potential top 1% of high-ability professionals, the elite medical doctors, the specialized software engineers, the pioneering scientific researchers, and the visionary entrepreneurs are currently choosing to emigrate to the United States. Furthermore, the bleeding does not stop at the absolute peak. Anywhere from 30 to 50% of the next highest earning brackets are quietly following suit, packing up their advanced degrees and heading south. The reasons for this mass departure are entirely quantifiable. These individuals are leaving because the compensation packages in the United States are vastly superior, the taxation rates are far more forgiving, and the critical investment capital actually exists to fund their world-changing ideas. A top-tier systems engineer living in Toronto might earn half of what they could command in Texas or California, all while paying significantly more for basic housing, groceries, and utilities. This creates a devastating innovation vacuum. When a country exports its most brilliant minds, it does not just lose ambitious citizens, it permanently forfeits the revolutionary companies they would have founded, the intellectual property and patents they would have registered, and the massive tax revenue their high-value output would have eventually generated. A nation simply cannot build a prosperous, future-proof economy when its greatest global export becomes its own intellectual genius. The housing oligopoly and the wealth divide, as business investment dried up and industrial innovation stalled, all remaining domestic capital desperately sought a safe harbor, ultimately flowing into one singular, highly unproductive asset class: real estate. Over the last 2 decades, housing in Canada transitioned from a fundamental human necessity and a foundational pillar of community stability into the primary national industry. Rather than financing modern factories, tech startups, or advanced infrastructure, the banking sector and private investors funneled trillions of dollars into relentlessly bidding up the price of residential land. This obsession created a massive, system-breaking, unproductive asset trap. The national wealth gap is now widening at a breathtaking pace, but crucially, it is not because the economic elite are building revolutionary new products, scaling global enterprises, or adding tangible value to humanity. Instead, the top tier is hoarding immense wealth simply through passive land speculation, zoning monopolies, and relentless policy-driven asset inflation. This dynamic engineers a crushing reality for the bottom 50% of the population. This represents the most painful truth for the average citizen, particularly the younger generations. Millions of young Canadians faithfully followed the societal rules laid out for them. They pursued higher education, secured professional careers, and committed to working exhausting hours. Yet, despite doing everything right, they find themselves entirely locked out of the prosperity and stability that their parents so effortlessly enjoyed. Stagnant wages paired with a deliberately manufactured housing crisis mean that half the country is effectively working 40 to 50 hours a week just to pay exorbitant, inflation-adjusted rent to the other half. This is far more severe than simply missing out on the traditional milestone of purchasing a family home. It constitutes a structural suffocation of disposable income. When citizens spend up to 70% of their take-home pay on basic shelter, they cannot buy goods, dine at local restaurants, or support neighborhood services. This starvation of consumer spending systematically destroys small businesses and hollows out local economies, turning vibrant, productive communities into sterile dormitories for an overworked, underpaid working class. Escaping the comfort trap. For decades, Canada has drifted lethargically into what economists define as a lower growth equilibrium, trapped in an insidious, nationwide economic comfort zone. The country has historically been just affluent enough, and its social systems just functional enough to avoid a massive, unified political reckoning from an increasingly disillusioned middle class. This historical wealth buffer made the slow structural decline feel agonizingly tolerable, masking the severity of the underlying decay with the polite veneer of a functioning democracy. However, the sheer gravity of the macroeconomic math can no longer be ignored, delayed, or spun by political rhetoric. The comfort trap is violently closing. Relying exclusively on imported cheap labor to suppress domestic wages, while simultaneously trading massively inflated real estate back and forth among domestic investors, does not constitute a legitimate or sustainable economy. It is, by definition, a macroeconomic pyramid scheme of stagnation, and the foundation is actively crumbling. Recent technical recessions, characterized by painful, back-to-back quarters of negative economic growth, provide undeniable empirical proof that the system is cracking under its own immense weight. To escape this downward spiral, the final synthesis requires a total, uncompromising paradigm shift. The nation must aggressively pivot away from asset speculation and radically restructure its incentives toward massive capital investment, aggressive technological adoption, and the heavy rewarding of high-skill innovation. Taxation, zoning, and corporate policies must be entirely redesigned to ensure that entrepreneurial risk-taking, modern manufacturing, and intellectual brilliance are prioritized over passive landholding.